Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Sunday sermon. I'm bummed that we're not together, but I am thankful that through technology we can actually gather in our living rooms but be worshiping together as a church. So, Grace wanted to say good morning. So,
Hi.
and thanks, sweetie. We're going to get started, but before we do, I want to encourage you to grab your family and get a Bible and go ahead and read our sermon text for this morning. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 3. So if you would just read the entire chapter, I'll pause here. You go ahead and pause the video while you do that if you haven't already read. Read all of Daniel 3, the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego this morning. And we'll come back in a minute and we'll walk our way through the text. Okay, I remember a few years ago going to a Cardinal game in Cincinnati. We were there on a mission trip, and so like I always do when I go to away baseball games, I was decked out in my Cardinal gear. Ready for baseball season, especially on this nasty day. Thinking about baseball makes me happy. And so as we went to the game, got to the Cardinal game, or to the Reds game, it didn't take long for people to get a little bit hostile towards me wearing the Cardinal gear. So wearing the badge of honor like I did, I felt very proud to be sporting my Cardinal wear. But to be honest with you, people became a little bit abusive and a little bit kind of nasty towards me and were yelling things that I wasn't even comfortable with my family hearing. And so as I sat there, I started thinking through what are my options, and I realized that I could hide, or another option would be to go change shirts, or even be a total sellout and just go buy a Cincinnati Reds shirt and put it over my Cardinal shirt. But I did what was right and what was godly and what was holy and true. I just continued to sport my Cardinal gear proudly because they are obviously the best and most wonderful baseball team of all time. But it was kind of funny. While it wasn't like genuine persecution that you would think of as Christians. For a minute there, I was really getting harassed for wearing my Cardinal gear. And as we're looking at this amazing story this morning, I'm not at all trying to compare that moment with what's going on in the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But I do believe that we as followers of Jesus in our culture are going to have more and more situations where to be authentic in our faith, to love Jesus deeply, to be clear with our testimony and truth, is going to put us in positions where our culture is going to be in shock. I can't believe you really believe that. Or basically demand that we cater to their beliefs and embrace their beliefs while at the same time bowing our beliefs and doctrines. And so I think that we as a church and as a people of God need to look at this story as something that will help us, something that will shape us, something that will move us in the culture. And so this morning, just for a few minutes, I want to talk about this story. I have a different sermon prepared for now next Sunday from this text. So we're not going to be skipping this text like we did a couple weeks ago where I preached the sermon I had prepared. But I just have some thoughts from this to help us, and especially since a lot of us are going to be sitting in a room with our kids, a chance for us to talk about this story. It's a great story, story of bold faith and of courage and of God's deliverance of his people in the midst of a fiery trial. And so we know it is a story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I've heard it as my shack, your shack, and a bungalow, which if you're laughing at that, you're corny like me, loving dad jokes. But and of course, VeggieTales came along and made a very fun rendition of this that they called Rack Shack and Benny, which I've actually placed that at the bottom of your family worship. You might, if you've never watched that, or even if you have and you have younger kids, you might spend a few minutes watching that VeggieTales together. And of course in that we get the great the bunny song, the bunny, ooh, I love the bunny. Now, If you've never heard that, you're wondering why I'm doing that. Well, you'll have to go watch Rack Shack and Benny to figure it out. But that VeggieTales, they did a very good job of kind of interacting with the story and wrestling with it, and showing us the tension of the moment. And so this is a big story. One of the things as Christians we need to know is that there will be times, whether it's peer pressure in high school or middle school, whether it's sitting in a classroom where core ideas are being presented that actually confront our faith and trying to figure out, will I stay silent or will I speak to this? Or dealing with attitudes and values that exist in our culture that push back on our faith. For some of you, your jobs are places where you have to make decisions that are rooted in your faith. Many days and many times as you try to figure out what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus in a world that doesn't have values. And so issues like greed, like sexual ethics, like the value of humanity and the beauty of humanity are part of struggles that the culture around us and your jobs and your bosses or your schools or other places we go in our culture don't see these things the same way. And we need to wrestle with what it looks like to love Jesus and stand for him. And that's what this story helps us with. There's a man named Brother Andrew who actually is a person who understood persecution, had been through it, and had seen the church. And he says this. He says, there are two kinds of people in the world. Those who say about persecution, it will never happen here. And those who say, I thought it would never happen here. The saddest experience is meeting people who used to belong to the first group, but now belong to the second. Looking back, they can realize that the signs of impending persecution were present, but for some reason they didn't prepare for it. Perhaps they allowed their faith to become complacent or seduced by materialism, or they refused to believe that the conditions were changing in their country. I think that is a timely statement for us, and I think it's something that we need to hear because even in our culture, the more we hold to authentic Christian beliefs, the more we stand on what God has said, the more it will put us at odds in the culture. And we have to figure out what it looks like to hold those beliefs, but hold those beliefs and hold our love for Christ more than anything in a way that is good for the culture, loving for the culture, but clear in who we are in our faith. And so we have this story, and it's an amazing story, a story that comes right on the heels of Daniel interpreting this dream of a great statue. And we'll talk more about this next week, but I do find it kind of funny that Nebuchadnezzar's response to the dream is to go build a statue. Didn't quite get what God was trying to say to him, but he goes and builds a statue made of gold. It's 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide. It's made of gold, so solid gold, so great value, and it would have glistened, been visible for miles, on this plain that is probably right outside the city of Babylon, something that stood in many that could have been seen from a far distance. It would have taken a while to build, so people would have been walking by it and seeing it quite a bit for a while. But now, once it's completed, there's this dedication ceremony. In the dedication ceremony, Nebuchadnezzar brings all of his leaders out, all the government leaders and people from all over the place, and people from all kinds of different cultures and backgrounds. Babylon by this time had become a very multicultural city, and so we see him calling people of all languages, all peoples to come to this place. Now, one of the interesting things, if you know biblical story, is that this is very possibly the exact same place where generations before they had tried to build the Tower of Babel, which was another great monument to human greatness, as people were literally saying, I don't need a God, we can reach God, we can do this on our own. And now Nebuchadnezzar's building a tower. That tower may have been a statue of himself, or it may have been a statue that is representing one of the gods of Babylon, but no matter what it was, it was definitely Nebuchadnezzar trying to point to their worship, their values, their attitudes, the greatness of Babylonian culture and religion, and ultimately his own greatness and fame, and telling everybody they must bow. And so he tells them, listen, here's the deal. When the music starts playing, we're going to bring the band out, all kinds of instruments. It's going to be a party. And when the music starts playing, here's what you're going to do. You're going to bow down. You're going to literally get on your face. in submission. You are going to worship, which means you are going to see this as divine and pay homage to it, and you are going to serve this God, meaning that you're going to give energy, time, talents, and treasures to making this God great and making this God known. And so, time for the band to play, and the band hits the chord, and they start playing the song, and everybody bows except a few people. Now, there is something interesting in the text. It's in verse 8 where it says, therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. I think there's a hint in this text that I never really saw when I was growing up. I always thought everybody bowed. There were only 3 men who stood. It may be that most of the Jewish people stood, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the story become the people that they're going to make an example of. I actually think that's probably what's going on, that these people who've been rescued and redeemed by the one true and living God, who had a covenant with God, together they said, we can't do this. We know what our Old Testament says. We understand our history and understand that the reason we're even here in Babylon is because we have committed idolatry over the years. And so it may be that the whole nation, or at least a lot of the Jewish people, understood what was being asked of them and went, this is a violation of what God has clearly told us. As you read the 10 Commandments, the first 2 commandments are no other gods and to make no idols. In fact, if you did the New City Catechism this week as part of your worship here just a few minutes ago, you covered this, that no idols and only one God, and we only worship him. We don't bow down, we don't serve, we don't worship anyone but the one true and living God. And so that very thing is being put to test here. And the Hebrew people as a whole, probably at least Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when the music started playing, they did not bow. And so what you end up with is some of the Chaldeans. These are people possibly who were kind of into things like sorcery and witchcraft. At the very least, were Babylonians who were jealous of the fact that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had been placed in a position of power and authority over them after Daniel interpreted the dream. And so what takes place is, out of their jealousy, out of their anger, they come and they talk to Nebuchadnezzar and tell Nebuchadnezzar that these 3 people didn't bow. They've dragged these 3 men, these 3 Jewish men, in front of them, or in front of Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar warns them, gives them a second chance. Listen, if you don't bow, if you don't pay homage, if you don't worship this idol, we are going to throw you into the fiery furnace. It says here, they don't pay attention. Verse 12 says, these men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. And verse 13 says, Nebuchadnezzar was in furious rage. This is what happens, that we will have situations where we know what God has said. We know that worship and loving the Lord our God and loving him only will put us in a situation where there are certain things we can't do, certain things, places where we're asked to serve other gods, and we can't do that. Certain beliefs that we were told to accept that we know that following Christ puts us at odds with those beliefs. And we're going to have moments where we have to decide, will we actually bow down or will we stand strong? And I think of all the things that could have gone through Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's head. They may have thought, we got put in this position and we have this great influence. Man, if we just bow down here, and do it like not our hearts, just the posture. If we just like kneel, this won't be a big deal. And man, we will get a chance later to have conversations about our faith, to tell people about our Lord. Or they may have thought, you know what, bowing down with my body is a compromise I can make because they can't have my heart. So maybe I bow down with my body, but I keep my heart strong against. But really, the truth of the matter is the command was not to bow down at all to any other gods. Or maybe they could have thought, this is no big deal. This is just a minor thing. I don't think anybody would notice. Everybody else is bowing down. So if we bow down, people won't even notice that we do this. All kinds of ways that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could have looked at that moment and rationalized giving in and doing what everybody else was doing. but they didn't. And the reason they didn't is they understood who they were. They understood what had been done for them. They understood that they were people who had already been loved by God and rescued from him. In fact, that's one of the things that I need to highlight for you real quick here as we look at this. It's easy to read this and other stories like it and think that what I need to do is to give you power, willpower to stand strong, to almost give you a locker room speech that tells you that you can do it, buck it up, you can endure. But really, none of the stories in the Bible are asking you to lift a weight on your shoulders and to try harder and be better and to do more. Actually, this is a story about what the gospel is and should be doing in us. That the gospel produces in us a beauty and a hope and a love for Christ that is so deep and so rich and so beautiful that nothing can steal it. And so that's what we have here. And ultimately, this is what's going on in the story. We need to realize that there are stories that are uphill to the cross, meaning they are leading us to point to look to Jesus as our hope and our redemption. And there are stories that are downhill from the cross. In other words, it's speaking of people who have experienced that hope and redemption. And in this story, these are Hebrew people who understand that God has rescued them from slavery. He has made them a nation. They are in a covenant. And that covenant, that relationship they have with God ought to change them and ought to give them an affection for God and God alone, that they wouldn't want to have other gods. And that's what's happening in this story. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, even though they live in a foreign culture, have come to understand who they are. They know that God loves them. They know that God is for them. They know that they have a relationship with their Creator because of what He has done for they and their people. And it has created a love, a passion where they love God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so when the music plays, it's that love and that understanding of who they are that compels them. This is what we need. We need to more deeply love Jesus, to be drawn to him in a greater way, to love what he has said in his word more and more and more, and to realize that what that puts us, what that will do is cause us to love him in such a way that we will definitely notice when we're being asked to do something that is a violation of that love. To kind of illustrate this, I think about my own relationship with my wife and my family. When we were dating, most of the time it would be jealousy that would drive things. And so I might do things out of jealousy, thinking, if I don't act right or if I don't do things just correctly, she might go elsewhere. And I was afraid to lose her. And that was often a motivation early even in our marriage for me for a lot of things that I would do. But now that we've been married for 30 years, the reason I don't look at other women or have interest in anything else is because I have come to love she and my kids so much that I know the best place for me is right here with my family, with my wife in this house. That the thing that causes me to prosper, that my greatest joy is in them. And so anytime, my heart could stray to think, oh, what if I did this or what if I went there? It's very easy after this period of time to realize, man, I can't even fathom that. I can't fathom bowing to another idol because what I have in God is so rich and so beautiful. I can't even fathom thinking about another woman because what I have in my wife is so rich and so wonderful that I don't want anything else. I think this is the way God works in us, that the more we walk with Christ, the more we love Jesus, the more beautiful he will be, and the more we couldn't do anything other than walking with Christ and loving Jesus. Now, truth is that idols are all around us, and so the challenge is always there. And so what I want to do with the rest of the sermon is I just want to encourage you, first of all, as individuals who live in a world, to look at this story, to find beauty in it, and to start thinking about, what it would look like for us to have those moments. I also want us to invest in our kids this morning. I want you to realize that the task we have is very significant because I do think that they are going to grow up in a world that resembles what Brother Andrew warned us, that we are going to go somewhat from a world where, for my culture, we said it never it will never happen here. The random story here and there of somebody who stood for their faith and was persecuted, beat up, or put out of the culture, it was far and few between. I think our kids are going to grow up in a future where they're going to say, I thought it would never happen here, where it's more and more common. And what we see in this story is just three men who figured that out and figured out how to live in that. So it's easy then to read this story and go, see, this is it. It's a fight. It's a war. It's a battle. And real quick, I think we see in the story some postures that we could take. And I want to show you the posture I think they take that is always the posture of the people of God. So a lot of times you hear stories like this. A king builds a tower. A king builds an idol. There is a teacher at school who is attacking the Christian faith. There are things that come out in our culture that look at the beliefs of Christians and look down on them. And our first posture is to put our hands up and to fight and to act like, okay, it's us against them. And I don't think that's what's going on here. I don't think, there are a lot of opportunities before the music played where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could have taken a fighting posture. Or we see people, maybe another posture is to cross our hands and just to pull away and to distance ourselves, to just pull into ourselves and to kind of just get to ourselves, to not come anywhere near the culture. But what we see in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is the fact that they are part of the Babylonian culture. The reason they're included in this is because God has placed them in very significant positions. They know that's important. And so they live in those positions. They are serving the king. They are part of Babylon. They're living for the good of Babylon because they have been commanded to. Or there is this hands out kind of come give me a hug kind of posture of just saying, we're just going to embrace the culture. And I think that's dangerous because often in that posture, you will rationalize, you will bow down to the things, the culture. You will end up kneeling before the idol because you just embrace the things of the culture. You embrace the beliefs of the world. You try to mix them in with your beliefs to try to make it work. And believe it or not, we actually saw a crazy example of that in our own city this last week with what happened with the Methodist Church and two approaches to this big question. And on one side, literally said, listen, we want to love all people. And so because we want to love all people, we are willing to adjust what is clear in Scripture to make it fit in the culture. Another side said, we want to love all people, and the only way to love all people is to stay faithful to what God has clearly said. And that clash with the Methodist Church was very interesting in our own city this week. The last posture, and I don't know if you can see this, is kind of, the lifting, and I think this is what we see, that the role of the believer, the role of the church, the role of the people of God in the culture is to realize that God has placed them here to lift in prayer and to lift with their own lives being faithful to Jesus as their king, to lift that culture towards the kingdom. And so this is what we find in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so what I really want to do for this rest of this talk is to say, okay, why? Why does God do this, and why does God allow it? Because very simply, God could have just struck down the Babylonians, or he could have stopped this in its tracks. I mean, it actually, in a very interesting way, as you read Daniel, flows from a dream that God gave Nebuchadnezzar that Nebuchadnezzar misunderstands. He turns it from something God is saying about his greatness, the greatness of God and his kingdom. And Nebuchadnezzar basically goes, oh, this is about me and building a statue to my own greatness. Why didn't God stop that? And why doesn't God stop Nebuchadnezzar in his tracks? Why do they end up in the furnace? As you read the story, one thing that's interesting is they don't end up just on the edge of the furnace. They actually end up in the furnace. And so what I want to do is I want to talk to you about 4 things that God is always doing in us when these moments come up. 4 things that his work in us. Why does God allow these things? And why does God put his church in situations where the culture does see them differently, or kingdoms do respond? Why are there places around the world where people literally being a Christian is dangerous? And four things that he is always doing. He does it in the story. He does it story after story. If we were to study people in church history, I could give you illustration after illustration of people where all these things are always true, what God is doing. And the first thing is that God is bringing glory to himself. That these stories, in maybe the greatest way, show the value and the beauty and the majesty of the God that we serve. What you have is Nebuchadnezzar, with human hands, builds a statue. In Isaiah 44, Isaiah starts making fun of people who do this, literally saying, so what you do is you grab a piece of wood or a piece of metal or a piece of gold, and then you shape it, and then you bow down to it. Do you see how silly that is? Do you see how crazy that is? And while we in our culture may not have shrines like this, we may not have idols, it is amazing how much of the idolatry in our culture is still built around things that are tangible, that we can put in our hands, we can put in our pockets, we can put in our bank account. And how much the call of God is to say, listen, those things are okay, but they are not worth bowing down to. They're not worth worshiping. But our culture fights back and says, this is the only thing that matters. And to live for something other than this is silly. And so for us, that's where the tension comes, is that we have to understand and hope to figure out how we do that. But when we stand in those moments, when it's darkest, when it's hardest, when people face the greatest potential for suffering, what happens is their response that comes through the power of the Holy Spirit in their lives, their trust in God, the truth in them, their response is what will end up shaping the world around them, to see how valuable, how wonderful, and the true character of the only God. It's interesting, in verse 15, Nebuchadnezzar, when he's filled with rage and says, okay, I'm going to give you a second chance, but when the music plays now, you will bow down. And he basically looks at him and says, but if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast in a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? In other words, Nebuchadnezzar is literally looking at them going, man, I don't know who this God is, but you need to realize there's no God who can save you from me. No God who can save you from me. I think that will happen for some people. And the truth of the matter is that in those moments, the response of people who look and go, listen, you can take my life, you can take my home, but you cannot take the God who is in me and who is for me away from me, is a powerful testimony of the glory of God. Later, we find that God does save. And we realize that the God who rescues Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego makes his glory known. And so what will happen is we live authentic lives of trusting Jesus. What will take place is that God will demonstrate his character, who he is in us. He will demonstrate his power, and he will demonstrate through our lives what it looks like for people to treasure and to value and to love him more than anything, even life itself. And that's how God makes his glory known. John Piper has said this, that God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. In other words, the way that God makes his glory known is through people who want Jesus more than anything and are willing to lose everything and keep Christ. That is how God makes his worth known. And so God is giving his fame and his glory, which is good for all of us. The world needs to see the glory of God. They're blinded to it. They're veiled to it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are going to make that glory known by saying, you know what, King? We serve the one God who is able, and he is also willing. He is able to save us. That's his character. He is willing to save us. That is his purpose. And but then they say, listen, even if he doesn't, we won't bow down to your God. And so that's the first thing. Second thing that God is always doing is these events happen for the good of his people. In other words, for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as they stand, there are really only two outcomes. Outcome number one is that God saves them in the furnace, and the second outcome is that God saves them through the furnace. Now we look at this and we think, okay, outcome one, good. Outcome two, not so much, because we tend to think that this world is all there is. That fiery furnace does not look like a fun moment. But the truth of the matter is, whether God saved them out of the furnace or through the furnace, in other words, if the way God chose to save them was through the way that he did, which is by rescuing them, That's beautiful. And now Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their faith is even stronger. Their faith is even truer. Their mission is even bolder. They understand who they are in a greater way. But if God chose to rescue them through the fire, in other words, this was the end of them, had the flame consumed them, that we need to realize that glory is a good thing. And the promises of God that this earth is not all there is something that we need to hold on to. And either way, it is for individually for our good. But we also need to realize that there's something rich going on in this story, in that the rest of Israel is watching as well. And so there is good for all of the people of God in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in their response. They have been placed in this moment at this time. One of the themes that we've been studying all through this book is the fact that this book is about the sovereignty of God. God's sovereign, his control, absolute control. And he has placed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in this situation for the good of his people, so that both these three men and that the Jewish people around would see again the power of their God, and their faith would grow. Which leads us to the third thing, that what is God always doing? He is building his own community. There is beauty in the community of Christ. The nation of Israel's story is not a good one in this area. Their whole history is time after time after time. They have, time after time after time, they have bowed down to the idols of the nations around them. They have embraced other ideas and left their God for other gods, or at the very least would have an attitude where they would worship their God on the Sabbath, on Saturday, and then the rest of the week they would follow the ways of other gods, other nations. They would bow down to other idols. And so often this is what we do, is that we would, on Sunday we do church. We're Christian people, and we kind of have the label. But the truth is that when it comes to the attitudes, values, the idols of the world around us, that the rest of the week we just kind of embrace them into our lives and kind of mix what we believe on Sunday with what everybody else believes, and come up with something that's very different than the gospel and the truths that we learn from Christ. and this is what the nation has done for generations in the Old Testament. And the Babylonian exile itself is God's loving discipline of his nation to try to get rid of that in them. And now this Hebrew community, the people of God in the nation at this time, are being transformed. And one of the things that happens, this story is for that community. We need more stories like this. We need to see beautiful stories like, I was just this week seeing the story of Corrie ten Boom and reminded of her story in Nazi Germany, where the Nazis were, doing what they did with Jewish people. And the story of she and her dad and her sister, their family, hiding Jewish people. And the fact that they ended up getting arrested and ended up going to internment camps with the Jewish people that they had been protecting. And both her dad and her sister passed away. But in the end, God rescued her, and she continued telling her story of grace, of forgiveness, of boldness, of God's work. And her, the tweet I saw this week reminded that the story of the hiding place, which is her story, ought to be reading for every Christian. If you've never read her story, do it. Read it with your kids. Learn that story, because we need these stories. Like when we have stories like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, like Corrie ten Boom, what happens is it builds all of our faith, and the community of faith is stronger together because we know that God is good in the midst of it, and we feel his presence through these stories. Even this week, as you meet with your community group, talk about stories that you might have, or stories you might know of people who had moments like this, who realized that there was a point where things were difficult and tough, and to live in the culture meant to go one way, but to honor God meant to go the other, and how people wrestled with that decision, but also how God demonstrated his goodness so that the community of faith is built. This brings us to the last thing I want to point out, and that's something that is really clear in the text, the fact that God uses these moments to advance his kingdom. Because what happens in the story is that when they come out of the fiery furnace, first of all, there's the fourth guy walking around the furnace. We'll talk a lot about this next week, but that fourth god who Nebuchadnezzar calls the son of the gods, he gives us a hint to who I believe the real character of the story is, that Christ has shown up in the furnace with his people, which he will always do. But also the world saw this. They come out, they're hair's not singed and it doesn't smell of smoke. Their clothes aren't singed. God does a total miracle. While being thrown in, several of Nebuchadnezzar's strongest soldiers are killed by the flames, but these Hebrew boys are not harmed. And so what happens, look at verses 27 and 28 in the story where Nebuchadnezzar is speaking. Verses 27 and 28 says, the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw the fire had not any power over the bodies of those men. The hair on their heads was not singed, and their cloaks were not harmed. No smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered, who saved, who rescued his servants, and who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command, and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. And so he speaks of the God that they worship being the Most High God, and he honors them for standing. What's going on here? Now the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Old Testament, the God who rescued the people in Exodus, that God is now known in Babylon because that God has made his glory known through those people. Now here's what's really interesting. Of course, if people are rescued from a furnace, that will happen. But one thing you need to realize is all through history, when God's people came to points where their persecution has happened, that God has advanced his kingdom the most in those situations. In other words, if we want our city to know God, to know Christ, to understand the gospel, one of the ways that God does that is people who will say, you know what? I'm going to stand with Christ, and even though it may put me at odds with my family or my culture or my job, I have to do this. And often, at the same time people are angry, they start wondering, why would people stand this way? Why would they live like this? It is often in church history when people actually died for their faith, had these moments, and rather than saving them out of the flames, God saved them through it, that God has made his glory known, that he has been present with them in this, and people would see the attitude. If you read church history, it's actually kind of crazy how often people who are being burned at the stake go out singing hymns and worshiping in a very clear way. And the people around will watch and go, I don't have a category for this. This doesn't make sense to me. And so that's the point of the story. That's the idea. It's not, listen, here, you need to have bold faith. We do, but that bold faith comes as we, as the people of God, see his goodness, experience the gospel. And so we look to Jesus. Jesus is our hope, and Jesus is being pictured in the story. Of course, he's the fourth man in the furnace. But really, in a very real way, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stand as representatives for the nation of people who will stand before God and do what is right, no matter what takes place. They were rescued, though. But Jesus, on the other hand, endures the cross, despising the shame. And he was not rescued out of the flame. He was rescued through the flame. And what we have is the hope of his resurrection, that the enemies of God will not stand, and that life eternal is promised, and that his resurrection is proof that no king, not Nebuchadnezzar, not your boss or your school, not our culture, no king will ever have the final say, and God's goodness will eventually reign in your life. So there's a message for you guys to think about and to talk about and to just have a conversation with your family. Hope you have a great snowy morning. As I've been sitting here watching this, the snow just keeps falling and it's getting thicker and thicker on my deck. So I think we made the right choice. But I miss you all, and I can't wait to see you next week. So God bless.